Yeah, no worries.
Shareholders. Oh, yeah.
All right, so we might just get started. Hello, my name is Rihanna. I work at a company near here called Strategic Data. So what we do is we do a lot of surveys, we get a lot of data, and we analyze it and then send it back to people. A lot of our contracts are to do with government contracts. So as some of you might know, as of December last year, all government websites and applications had to be accessible to a certain standard. So that's how I got into this, because we had that, and they were all like, oh, Rihanna, you're a front-end developer, surely you can make this accessible. I was like, sure, alt tags, let's put alt tags everywhere, and then everything will be accessible forever. And yeah, no, accessibility actually, it turns out, is quite complicated, and there was a lot of kind of mixed resources out there. There were a lot of resources from around 2002, which were really, really old school, and there was some newer stuff that it was quite hard to read and understand. And so I delved in and I learned as much as I could, and then I like to come and give these sort of talks to kind of help people out, give people a place to start off, give people an overview of what it's all about, and hopefully people will go out and have a better idea of what it actually is, that is not too hard, and give them the confidence to start themselves. Okay. So why is accessibility important? As I already mentioned, we had a government project and it had to be accessible to a certain standard. It's also really important because a lot of the user base, a lot of people have disabilities. And what accessibility does is it makes your website or application easier for people to use if they have a disability. It's approximately 1 in 5 people in Australia. For example, about nearly 500,000 people have a visual impairment. So we've really got to make things easier for people to use. Otherwise, you kind of exclude everybody from using it, you lose your market base, and a lot of people can also get sued for this. So recently there was the Coles case in Australia. If you've used it yourself, for like a sighted person, it's really, really hard. And you got all the way to the end, and there was a part at the end where you had to choose what time the delivery was, and it wasn't accessible with her screen reader, so she couldn't actually get her groceries delivered. So yeah, so they settled out of court. I think it was around 9 million. There was also a case in with Target in America where they got sued as well, because same thing, couldn't use the site with a screen reader. And probably one of the more classic cases that started this all off in Australia was in 2000, when a blind man sued the Australian Olympic Committee because he couldn't go onto their site and order tickets for the Olympics with his screen reader. So it's really, really important that we make our sites accessible for everyone, really. I think it also makes the sites a lot easier for people in general, but we'll go through that. So this talk is a talk of 4s. So what we're going to talk about is the 4 types of disability that we address with accessibility. We're going to talk about the 4 principles of accessibility, and I'm going to give you my top 4 tips of where to start with accessibility, some of which you're probably already doing, because a lot of it is actually current best practice, but now you can actually say that, oh, we're doing this for accessibility, and yeah. Okay, so one of the more obvious ones, and one of the ones that I was just talking about, is making things accessible for people with visual impairments. So this is like any disability, this is on a really wide spectrum. So it's from people who are fully blind and need to use a screen reader. They might also have a braille reader, everything like that. So I gave a presentation recently on JAWS. JAWS is the biggest screen reader that's out there. As well as people who have, if I take off my glasses, I'm technically got a visual disability, so it's for people, yeah, like me as well. There's also probably a few of you here with colour blindness, and that is also under visual disability. So making sure that your sites can actually be seen by people who are colourblind. It also, under this one, is also people with tunnel vision. So one of the directors for my company actually has tunnel vision, so he can only see about that much, and the rest is kind of blacked off. So how he uses a computer is that he turns up the contrast. So instead of having black text on a white background, it flips it, so it's white text on a black background. And then he has a special one with a cursor, so the cursor's a lot bigger and you can see it move around the screen. And then sometimes he also uses a screen reader to help read everything out. So it's a really, really wide range. So to make sure things are used by a screen reader. The other one that comes up a bit as well is to make sure that people who don't have such good sight, a lot of people zoom in and make the text bigger. So this is people who may be a bit older, they're having a bit of trouble seeing. They might zoom it into about 200%. So to make sure that your layout doesn't break at this point. A lot of the times it does. I accidentally, when doing this, made an SVG of a nice diagram. It was all beautiful, it was gorgeous, and then as soon as I zoomed in, the diagram actually got smaller for some reason. So it wasn't really very accessible, so I went through and I redid that to make it get bigger instead and not break the layout. Okay. The next one I'm not going to talk about too much. The next disability is people with hearing impairments. So I think people are pretty familiar with this. This is actually quite common. It's about 1 in 6 people have a hearing impairment. This is only really applicable if you have any sound on your website. So if you've got a video on your website, to just make sure you've also got a transcript or you've got closed captions. If you want to be really, really fantastic, you need to have somebody doing sign language as well as the video is going, but that's only if you want to be really, really fantastic. As long as you've got the transcript, closed captions, you're pretty fine with this one. If you've got any other kind of sound that comes up, to maybe an alert to tell people that something's happened, just making sure you've got something visually happening on the screen as well to let people know. Or if you've got any music or videos that autoplay when you go onto your site, maybe don't have these, because everybody, yeah, I can't think of anyone that actually likes these. So, okay. This one doesn't come up that much, but it is also a really, really common one. This one is people with motor impairments. So it could be somebody even with RSI, so a temporary motor impairment. It could be somebody in a wheelchair. It could be somebody who's a bit older and has arthritis. Anyone who has trouble moving their hands around and has trouble with fine motor control. So generally people who have trouble with this will rely a lot more on the keyboard than the mouse, because they might have trouble holding onto the mouse and moving it around. So they might use the keyboard for everything. There's also a lot of people who just prefer to use the keyboard for everything because it's a bit quicker and they like having keyboard shortcuts for everything. So for this one, we're just going to make sure that, yeah, people can access everything via the keyboard. And I'll talk about it a bit later as well. But also, if you have anything that works on a touch device, to make sure all your icons are big enough and spaced out enough so that people won't have trouble to get those ones. Okay. The fourth type of disability that we look at is intellectual impairments. So this is probably one of the trickiest ones because it's one of the ones that are the most silent. If somebody is blind or deaf, or if they're in a wheelchair, it's generally quite easy to have a look at them and figure it out. But people with intellectual disabilities, they might not even be aware. So this is a really, really important one to think about as well, to just make sure that your user experience is as easy as possible, to make sure that all the instructions are nice and well written, to make sure everything's really logical and really easy to get through. If there's any big words, making sure there's a bit of a glossary or somewhere to help them. And also, error recovery is the biggest one that they look at for this one. So making sure that if there's a form to fill out, for example, and an error pops up, that the error helps them to continue filling in the form and finishing the task. Because if it's a really obscure error, like field required, but you're not actually showing what field they haven't entered in properly, then it's just going to be really, really confusing for them. Okay. So that was the 4 types of disabilities. Now, we're now going to look into the 4 principles of accessibility. These are called the PAW principles, P-O-U-R, PAW principles. So the first of the 4 principles is perceivability. So this is making sure that everyone that comes to your site or application can perceive everything. So they can see it, if not they can hear it from the screen reader, that if they zoom in it doesn't break the layout and everything doesn't go everywhere. If they have color blindness, that you don't have red text on a green background so the text isn't obscured. Just making sure everyone, it seems pretty straightforward, that everyone who goes to it can see everything, can hear everything, and can navigate it. The next principle is operable. So making sure that everyone who goes there can get to everything. So this is like I was saying before with the keyboard accessibility, which I'll go into a bit later, is making sure everybody can get to every single part using the keyboard, so not using the mouse. Also using the mouse, obviously, we want to do that as well. But just making sure they can get through the entire thing and not have any problems with that. Which makes sense. If people can't use it, then they're going to go somewhere else. Understandable. This one links back to the intellectual disabilities. So making sure that when the person uses it, that they understand what's going on, they can read all the words, they can go through it, they can go through the whole workflow from start to finish, and have a sense that they've understood what's going on. This is also for if somebody's deaf, making sure you've got the closed captions or a transcript. So making sure everybody understands what's going on. The last one is robust. This is best practice anyway. So robustness is making sure that it works on all platforms. So it works in Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer 7 or 8. And making sure it works on phones, tablets, all those sort of devices. You don't want to exclude a person or a demographic just because they've got an old browser or because they've got an old phone or because they're using something a bit different. This one's also really important if you have any market that's overseas and maybe they don't have as fast as internet as in Australia, especially on their phones as well when it's not really very fast. So making sure that you have a really quick load time, that people can see everything on the phone and they're not standing there waiting for a 14 megabyte web page to download. Okay. So those are the 4 principles. So we're going to be talking a bit about them as I go through all my tips. So these are some tips that I like to put because they're what I like to call easy wins. There are things that are more difficult and things that are more advanced, but this are kind of a good starting point to start. Because if you go and look at the W3C guidelines for accessibility, it's a monstrous document. It is so technical, it is so hard to navigate, it is really, really frustrating to read sometimes. So it's really good to just have an idea of where things fit in. I'll just talk a little bit about the guidelines. So for governments at the moment, everything has to be at least AA standard. That's the one that my project had to be, AA standard. This gets assessed by an external authority. So for example, Vision Australia do a lot of these audits, where they'll actually go through and they'll go through every single page and they'll tell you whereabouts things are wrong. So where you've done something different, where they couldn't get through to with a screen reader, where they couldn't tab to with the keyboard, where they didn't understand what was going on, where your HTML was marked up incorrectly. They go through and they tell you all this and they tell you at what sort of standard. So AA is a really, really good standard. AAA is the best standard. Very few ones are AAA, but that's okay. And A is kind of the minimum standard. So if all websites got to A, this would be fantastic. This means that somebody using assistive technology going to your site can actually get around it. It's kind of the baseline. It means that they don't get to the end and get told, no, you can't finish your order, you can't finish this because your screen reader can't access it. So it's kind of the minimum standard. Okay, so we've got the Holy Grail layout here: header, navigation, main content, sidebar, and footer. So when a screen reader, this is about screen readers, so when it goes to a site, it reads it through kind of like a book. It's quite frustrating to listen to sometimes. If you go to a site that isn't marked up correctly or doesn't have any of what I'm going to tell you in place, it reads it out like a book. So the screen reader starts at the top, it reads the header, navigation, content, sidebar, footer, and it reads it through every single time. So if you've got a website that has multiple pages and has the same kind of banner at the top, footer at the bottom, same sidebar, it's going to get really, really frustrating for them because it's going to start at the start and read it like a book every single time, and it takes absolutely forever. There are a lot of shortcuts with screen readers, so they can jump around the page just like we do. So when we look at a site, we might ignore the header and might look straight at the main content. If there's a big picture, if there's a button to press, anything like that, we can see it straight away and go, ah, that's what we need to do. So that's kind of what we have to emulate when we're using a screen reader. We have to put in little markers around to let the screen reader know, all right, this is the main content, this is the header, this is the navigation. So a person using a screen reader can navigate it like we do. With HTML5, it does a lot of this already for you, so it's not as complicated as it used to be. So any forms, as long as they're marked up correctly, they'll be able to skip to forms easily. If you've got your headings marked up correctly, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, they can skip through them. If you've got your links marked up correctly, they can skip to the links. So another side point, making sure your links kind of make sense out of context is also really good for this, so they can skip to them. But there are things that are more ambiguous that they're not going to be able to skip to, because we don't have a way in the HTML to go, right, this is the main content, or this is the sidebar, or this is the navigation. We don't have those sort of elements yet. I think they are being worked on, a few anyway, which is really good. But yeah, we don't really have those. So these are some attributes that we can put into our HTML to let the screen reader know. This is the header, this is the navigation, main content, sidebar, and footer. And then it's just a really quick to just skip to these parts. So I'll just show you what it looks like. So it's just as easy as that. We just put in this role attribute. So this is an ARIA role. So we put banner for the header. So then they know that's what they're reading. For the navigation, we just put the role navigation. This one's quite interesting because when you do go to a site with JAWS and it has this marked up, it goes, there is one navigation, and then you can quickly press a button and you can get to the navigation. This is probably the quickest and easiest thing that you can do to make it so much easier is to put this role main in your main content. It's just 2 button presses, you can skip to the main content, and then you don't have to read everything out again and again and again because it just takes so long. If you've ever had to listen to a screen reader and navigate a web page, it is really excruciating unless you've got these sort of things. We've also got one for sidebar, which is complementary, and one for footer, which is content info, so they can skip around and they know what they're reading with that sort of context. There are some more advanced ones. These are mainly if you've got anything that's kind of interactive. So if you've got a pop-up, a modal that pops up, there's a little bit more work involved. If you've got accordions that can expand and contract, there's a little bit more work there. If you've got JavaScript on your page that is updating anything dynamically, so if you've got a progress bar, for example, that's going across, you can put some in there to let them know 50% done, 75% done, 100% done. Those ones are a little bit more complicated, but it's still the same principle. So it's just putting these ARIA roles and attributes into your HTML. It doesn't take too long, and it just makes it so much quicker and easier. Okay, my next tip is, this is just best practice, so I'm pretty sure you guys would be working on this anyway. It's just to make sure that it works everywhere, that it works on all the browsers, on all the devices, absolutely everywhere. There's not one phone that it goes to and it breaks the layout, or you can't do everything with the layout. That it works on Internet Explorer is one of the most important ones, because people who use assistive technology like screen readers use Internet Explorer. Most of them, the majority of that, 80–85% of people will be on Windows, and most of the time they'll be using Explorer or maybe Firefox. So just making sure it works on all those. And generally they'll be on an older version as well. So making sure, if you can get it working on like IE8 in Windows XP, it's pretty much golden. You're pretty right after that. So when we are getting it to work on different devices like mobiles, this is, I'm sure people do this is best practice, but just making sure that everything is really big, everything's really easy to see. So people with motor difficulties, if they're using it, can actually press the buttons and find the buttons. Recently, the University of Melbourne was doing this. They were taking their site and making it mobile friendly, and they actually got a lot of students who had motor impairments to try out their site on the mobile. And a lot of them had a lot of trouble with it. They were unable to press things because things were too small. maybe they would press the thing next to it by accident. And sometimes, because it is mobile and because it is a little bit slower, they weren't getting any visual feedback to let them know, hey, you actually pressed this and something's happening, something's thinking, something's working. So that's another thing to do with being understandable and usable, to make sure that you get this feedback. Okay, I've pressed that button, and to know that it's been pressed and to know that it's actually thinking and processing it. Because sometimes if you've used it and the internet isn't very good, you press it and it doesn't tell you anything, and you press it again and again and again, and yeah, it causes a lot of headaches. So making sure things are nicely and spread out, making sure there's a lot of visual feedback, and making sure it works on as many things as possible. Okay, keyboard accessibility. This is probably one of the heaviest sort of ones. This is where I spend most of my time, is making sure that everything is keyboard accessible. So anything that you can do with a mouse or that you can do with a touch screen, you have to make sure you can also do it with the keyboard. I spent a lot of time on this making modals, so pop-ups, accessible. Really quite tricky, I found, to make sure that you can actually go there and you can tab around and you can do and you can read through the mobile properly with a screen reader, or that you can close the modal and open the modal and everything like that with the keyboard. So, tap indexes are your friend, making sure everything is accessible with the keyboard. If there's something that you can click on that isn't something that you can normally tab to or can normally get to with a keyboard, you have to make sure it has a tab index so people can get to it. So if there's an image or something that you can click on, you have to make sure that you give it a tab index so you can get to it. There's also ones to skip things. We had one table in our application, and you could tab to every part of the table, and it was really, really small and really, really long, and there was absolutely no reason why you should be able to tab to everything. So also making it so you can skip things. So tab index -1 is really great to just make sure that you can skip over things. If you don't have to get there, yeah, you don't want people to be there tabbing and tabbing and tabbing and tabbing to just try and get through the page. So tab index 0 is really awesome. Tab index -1. Tab index 0 is even more awesome because before with tab index 1s and 2s, you kind of have to do the whole page, and it's really, really annoying, or it jumps around everywhere. Tab index 0 is something that took me a while to find, and it gives you the tab order based on the HTML order. So you can put 0 there, and it will figure out where to go, so it's not tabbing all over the places. Other things you can do with keyboard accessibility is making a skip to content one at the start. So this is where you have a web page, and at the top there might be a little skip to content link, and it will skip you there. So you don't have to tab through all the navigation and tab through everything all the time. And just making sure that all your links work as well. This is really tricky because they work differently on different browsers. So the one that I like to nitpick a bit is Bootstrap, because we use Bootstrap a bit for our styling. If you go to the Bootstrap page, they have a lot of links down one corner, and it's a really, really long page. So you press the links and it sends you to the bits and pieces. You can't actually tab to those links, which is really, really frustrating. And if you do click there and you go to a link, it might have a little form, and you click on the form and you try and tab through the form to make sure you can actually go through everything. It actually sends you back to the start. And it is super, super frustrating. If I couldn't use the mouse for a site like that, I'd be there all day. So just making sure that when you tab to things, it's in the order that it seems like it should be, that you can tab to everything that you can click on, and that if it is a long page, having lots of back to top links or to main content links or links so people can navigate the page using the keyboard is really, really useful. The last one is to do with colour. As I've mentioned before, making things perceivable for people with visual disabilities. Part of this is to do with colour accessibility. Approximately 8% of males have red-green colour blindness. So you put red and green together and they look exactly the same. There's also other types of colour blindness. There's blue-yellow colour blindness, so same thing, putting blue to yellow, they look exactly the same. And there's also monochronism, so that's no colour at all. So when we keep this in mind, there's the obvious ones, like not putting green checks on a red background. Nice and obvious. I think most people do this pretty well. I don't think anyone's going to do that anyway because it doesn't look particularly well. It's also about making sure you don't give choices to do with color and no other visual cues. So for example, there was one I think last year where at the train stations, you know, when they have the green button and the red button, so the green button tells you the timetable and the red button is the emergency button. Yeah, there were some train stations where it was like push the green button for, push the red button for, and so people with colour blindness couldn't actually see it and couldn't actually tell the difference. So that is accessibility fail. So now they've changed it, so they've got press the left button for this and the right button for that. So it's just making sure that you put other cues there as well as colour cues. Same thing if you've got anything like wait for the red button to turn green, then press it. It's not going to work. You need to put something else there so people can tell that something's different and people can tell what to do. This is a tool that I use all the time. It doesn't look very fancy or anything. This is called the accessibility color wheel. I love this one so much. I use it all the time. You can put in your background color and your text color, and it tells you if it's accessible to a certain standard or not. And down here, it also shows you what it's going to look like for people with different color blindness. So this is the red-green color blindness. So red text on a green background, you can see that's nearly impossible to read. And as you can see there, it's failed. So I put it there at accessibility level AA, which is what I was doing. And just making sure things pass here. I haven't found a way to automate this, but this is just what I use when I'm not really sure. And just to have a look. Okay, so this is a bit what I was talking about before. Here I've used some color. I've used blue on yellow, which isn't a good choice. But when you hover over things, if you've got a color change, it's also good to have another change. So on this one, I've removed the underline so that there's some visual things that's going on. So what I do when I'm able to tab through things, I make sure that with every tab press, there's a visual change, and it's not only to do with color, that maybe you do an underline, you might want to change the size. There's some ones that change the size and it looks nice, or maybe something moves around, that there's some other visual indication that something's going on. This is also really important with keyboard accessibility, because if you've had to go and test a website using just the keyboard and not the mouse, it is so hard with some websites to actually know whereabouts you are on the page. You might be pressing tab and there's no visual cues at all. So just making sure that if you hover over it and there's a change, that there's also the same change if you tab to it, and there's the same change as if it's active. So if it's on a touch device, there are other ones with touch devices as well. I think there's touch on and touch move and those sort of ones that I won't go into. But to just make sure you have the same change and it's really consistent, so it's operatable independent of what device you're using, and if you do have any disability, and to make sure that it's not just color. Maybe you have an underline or anything like that. So thanks for that. Are there any questions?
The main drivers for people moving to accessible sites still the threat, either government legislation or still the threat needs to
I would like to think it's about being proactive, but I think practically it's a money thing. It does cost a bit of time and money and effort in order to make your site accessible. So unfortunately, unless there is kind of the monetary threat, I don't think a lot of people pay that much attention to it. That's why I try and do these ones, because these ones are really easy wins. It's putting a few attributes around, it's making sure you can tab to everything, and it's making sure your color choices and that your user experience is kind of sane and logical, and which is stuff you'd be able to do anyway. Yeah.
Are there any frameworks available that allow us to write sites and do our CSS in such a way that you can enforce accessibility?
There is a little bit that I've seen. There's nothing like Bootstrap. You can sort of do errors with CSS with accessibility. For example, I saw somebody and if they had an image and the image didn't have an alt tag, it would put a red line around the image. So you could actually have a look and see, oh, that image doesn't have an alt tag. I better go back and do that. Bootstrap, well, I do go on a bit about Bootstrap because, yeah, it's really it's not particularly accessible. It does actually, when you are copying and pasting things from Bootstrap, the HTML there does actually have a lot of attributes. It has a lot of ARIA attributes and roles and things, which helps the screen readers, which is really good. And they have fixed some of their colors to make them more accessible too, which is good. I actually went through and I did an article for SitePoint because a lot of the colors in Bootstrap weren't accessible. They didn't meet that color contrast checker, which is really frustrating. But they've actually gone through and changed some of those, which is nice. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Do you think it's ethical or unethical if we create a site for two different sites? So like probably the first page is asking, like, are you visually impaired, like that or something, and then we make so-called like a simplified version that probably truly accessible, and then we have a full site that.
I think that's what used to happen quite a bit when accessibility was a bit trickier. I think it's a lot of extra work to make two sites that you can go to. I think if you incorporate accessibility, that's better. It's kind of like the difference between making, I think, a website for the PC and a website for a browser, for a phone, instead of make it responsive and working on everything. I think that's kind of, I don't think it's unethical to do that. If you're putting in any effort, that's better. One thing that I have seen that's worked really well, one of the things we fell over with was because one of the ways that you can increase the color contrast yourself is by, as I was saying before, changing it so it's white text on a black background, which is really awesome, so you can see it. Unfortunately, this makes some things disappear. So if you're using Bootstrap, for example, and you do this on Firefox, you can't read text on buttons and you can't read text in forms. So you can also have things on your site where you have your own style sheet, which is high contrast, so that doesn't happen. So you can actually predict what's going to happen, so you don't have to test it in high contrast everywhere. I've also seen sites where you can increase the text size on it, so you can press a button and the text expands, so that way you don't have to test it. If you zoom into 200%, does it break the layout? So there are some ways that you can control it to make it easier so you don't have to test it on as many platforms, but I wouldn't go to the trouble of making two. I'd just kind of make one. Incorporate as much accessibility as you can. Yep.
What's the optimum level we need to reach between, like, to create a balance between an accessible site and a beautiful site? Because there is definitely a trade-off. When you do try to make something accessible, you're affecting the look and feel of the site.
I don't think that's true. I think if you make something accessible, you can also make it look really stylish and make it look really nice. I think that's really important to do that as well. Obviously, you can be a bit restricted to color choices and things, but apart from that, the nicer it is to look at, the nicer it is to use, the easier it is to use, the more accessible it is. I think they really go hand in hand. One that came up was the Victorian government work site, because it's a government site and they had to make it more accessible. What they did was they made it so much easier to use. They had this awful site and it had all these links on it and it was really, really hard to see anything. And what they did to make it more accessible was they found, I'm not quite sure if they use A/B testing or whatever, to find the parts that people use the most and to put them up the top, make them really big, easy to see, and make the whole user experience a lot more pleasant and easier to use. So I don't think you have to compromise. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned the government sites, they kind of got an external party to influence their accessibility. Are there other ways for you to assess your, I guess, product rating? Like, is there a site
there is actually a site that I use. Oh, I haven't put the link there, but I'll see if I can find it. It's one where, you know how you can go to the W3C site, you can put in your HTML and it checks it and tells you if your HTML is valid? Yep, there's one where you can do that and it tells you if your HTML is accessible or not. It kind of does overkill. It goes, oh, you have your file. We don't know if that's accessible or not, but try and make sure it's accessible. What I found with that one was that the same complaints that it came up with were the same complaints that Vision Australia talked about, nearly identical. This one was also good. I'll see if I can find it in a sec. Is because it told you which which guideline it was violating. So it was like violating guideline 1.12 or something, and then gave you a little link to the site to show you what that was, so then you could have an idea of how to fix it. So there are sites where you can put your accessibility checkers so that you can put your code in and it will tell you which parts might be a bit icky. Yep. Anything else? Cool. I think there's still a bit of time. Is there any other sort of aspect of accessibility that people would like me to go over? Is there something specific in the business that you guys are working on that, yeah?
We've started to use AngularJS as a front-end framework that kind of draws pages on the client side and not actually script and render the response. The browser doesn't really know that a response is changed. So how does a screen reader know about it? Can they know about it?
That's a good question. I haven't tried an Angular site with this yet, but it is traditionally screen readers are really, really bad at this. Anything with JavaScript, it doesn't know what to do. Anything when the page is changing, it's not quite sure what to do. Yeah, I would test it out with a screen reader, but if the AngularJS is putting in content and updating content, and it does have ARIA attributes in it, it does a lot better. The screen readers nowadays are doing a lot better with JavaScript and updating things. Sometimes it does fail. I had a table, and the table was sorting with JavaScript, and it completely fell over with it, so I had to get rid of that. That's probably the trickiest thing. That, and about approximately 2% of people have JavaScript turned off, which is a lot of people. And so, yeah, that's another part of accessibility, is making sure it works kind of without JavaScript. So that might actually be why, it is a tricky one, unfortunately. One thing I have done is the roll alert. Roll alert is my absolute favorite one, because roll alert, what it does is when the content does change, so for example, if I'm putting up an error message, I can put the roll alert there, and no matter where the person is on the page or the screen reader, it jumps back up to the roll alert to let them know, hey, an error has occurred, those sorts of things. But yeah, that's a tricky one, AngularJS. I'll have to look into that one a bit more. Cool. Anything else? Cool. So I've got a few tools here. So there's a few ones here that I've put up. WebAIM is probably my favorite resource for this sort of stuff. The website WebAIM has lots of different blogs, and it has lots of different code examples of all this sort of stuff, accessibility stuff. It's written really nicely as well, so I really recommend checking that out. It also, what I find interesting is it does these big surveys. So it surveys lots of people who use accessible technology like screen readers, and it sees what sort of platforms they use. So as I was saying before, how most people who use JAWS will use Windows. It does all that sort of thing, and a lot of people also, and it also shows how many of them use their mobile devices instead of the PC. So mobile devices are coming up a lot as well. For mobiles though, it's actually the opposite, because I don't think anyone really uses Windows phones. But so most people actually use Mac phones and Apple phones and Apple devices when they are using a touch device. And that's really good as well, because that also has the voiceover, which is really nice because it's really free. The one that I tested mostly is JAWS, because it's the most, it's about half, but that'll set you back about $900. So that one's, yeah, quite tricky. So voiceover is good because it's free. There's also NVDA, which is one that's on Firefox, which is completely free as well. Firefox also has a really good one. It's called Fangs, I guess because it's kind of like JAWS, I'm not sure. And what Fangs does is it shows you exactly what the screen reader is going to read, what it's going to say out, and it also shows you all your headings, and it shows you all your links, so that you can actually go in and go, oh, that heading, that is in the wrong order, or that link doesn't make sense by itself. Because these are the sort of things that you can skip to with a screen reader. So yeah, making sure your links make sense by themselves, so making sure it's not like read more or click here, so making sure they're in context, and also making sure your headings make sense as well. When I took over the project for accessibility, we had all these things that looked like headings, So when you're looking at it, you go, oh yeah, that's a heading. But when you mark them up, so when you use something like fangs, it wasn't a heading. It was like a legend, or it was a paragraph, or something like that, which just kind of looked like a heading. So that's another thing that you can do, and fangs is a really good tool for that. I'll see if I can open any of these ones. What's a good one? Yeah, so this is my accessibility color wheel if it opens it. Yeah, so this one is really good. You can put it to what level you want, so AA and AAA levels. And you can have a look and you can see kind of how it would look for different colors. And which ones it passed. So obviously on these ones, yeah, it looks kind of failed, but then this one's okay and that one's okay. So things like that are really good to use. I'll see if I can find the other one as well. Hold on a sec. This one's a checker. So this is the one I was talking about before. So this is one, I like this one. There are a few out there. I like this one because you can actually paste your HTML markup in it. A lot of ones you needed to just put in the URL. But for example, on the site that I was working on, you needed to log in. And so I couldn't paste the URL because all it would do was just check the accessibility of the login page. It wouldn't go anywhere else. So this one's really good because you can upload, you can put in your web address, you can upload a file, or you can paste your HTML. So if we put in a website, we can then have a look and we can see what errors it comes up with. Google generally has a lot of errors. A lot of social media sites, unfortunately, also have a lot of errors and are really inaccessible. So you can have a play with this one later, but this one shows you what kind of problems there are. So, for example, this Chrome image doesn't have an alt attribute. Text colors, color contrast, things like that. It actually tells you those sorts of ones. You can do likely problems. So it's like, I'm not sure if this one is actually an accessibility problem. Have a look. And all potential problems as well. So here it has the different checks, because there are lots of different checks and you don't want to have to search through them all the time. So these ones give links to the official documents. Yeah. So this is a nice cheap way that you can use to just put in your site and see how it goes. That one's off. But also making sure all your HTML is marked up correctly as well. That's part of the thing that they check. Vision Australia would check this as well. They put in all our HTML into validators and let us know if there are any problems. Because if it is marked up incorrectly, then the screen reader has a harder time. So for example, we had some Perl script that was generating HTML and it was putting like 3 labels and 2 inputs. And it was like, you can't do that sort of thing. So I had to customize a lot of things to have valid HTML. So that's another thing to do with robustness. Cool. Yeah. Yep.
Features like the colors, make things larger, or like
Mm-hmm.
even colors where the website, the live script doesn't work.
Okay.
Like workarounds for that, or is that how it is? Or?
To make the text larger?
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't tried to make text larger on a mobile device. Generally, making sure I think you can pinch and you can zoom in is really important. Making sure that the layout kind of works on a mobile. The one, making sure things with pop-ups, making sure they don't overflow and that you can actually get to things. So if you are zoomed in and you click on a pop-up, that it fits the screen, and making sure you can still press the X buttons, those sorts of things. I'll bring up the resource, the other one I have. It's, oh, if I can. This one is really, really good if you're doing mobiles. The BBC actually put together a lot of really detailed documentation about how to make things accessible on mobile, so that's where I would start with those sorts of things. As it has in there details about like how the icons should be, how far, what sort of feedback to give people. It has lots of different code snippets and things like that to sort of let you go. So if you are doing anything with mobile, I'd use this resource. Do you have a question? Sorry?
But in our site, it's how it does.
Oh yeah, we can do that. No worries. What's the website?
Page up people.
Page up people. Just .com or
Yeah.
let's see how it goes.
Married people.
It's taking a while. Must be lots of errors. Let's see how it goes. Is that the right website? Or yeah? Oh. Make sure it's the right one. Oh no, here it is. So there's 138 known problems. Let's have a look. You have all these images with no alt text. This one, some of the things aren't getting a color contrast. So yeah, the color contrast is failing on some of that. So it shows you what the code is, where the CSS is. So these sort of ones you can also see, these sites are also set up with good accessibility. So this one, for example, changed the background color and everything when I hovered over it. So you can tell where you are. Where else? Yeah, more color contrast. Yeah, I'd probably have a look at the colors. That's coming up with a lot of them. Yep. Lots and lots of colors that aren't quite high enough. But see, that's a really quick, easy change. If you go through and you use the accessibility color wheel, and you just find that color, but you just make it a little bit darker, or you make the background a tiny bit lighter, it looks pretty much the same, and you've gotten rid of like all these errors, which is really good. Really quick, easy start to do those ones. This one I also clicked on. It tells you when you click on it what the error is. It tells you what guideline it's violating. So this one was making it distinguishable. So this is to do with being perceivable, easier to see. It tells you what the requirement is, the description, and then it tells you how to fix it, which is really nice. So that's what I really like this site. This gave me pretty much all the information that Vision Australia gave me. I wouldn't actually, not to bag on them, they're actually really lovely, and they were helping me with a lot of problems that were a bit trickier. But a lot of them, I'm pretty sure they're just copied and pasted from this site, because this is a really comprehensive site. So I'll just go back and see if there's any other interesting examples, or if it's just mainly the color. Yeah. So see, it looks scary, but there's only a couple actually things there. Yeah, fix the colors. Oh, those are different colors, blue on green. Apparently that's not very accessible either. Yeah, the bootstrap colors are all kind of off. That bootstrap blue and the white, it's not accessible, so yeah. It's mostly colors. Let's see if I can find anything else. Yeah, mostly it's colors, because you can see some of these ones, you just can't see what it is. So let's have a look and see if we can find any other problems. Likely problems. Looks like there were 2 opening strong tags. Oh no, why are there 2 strong tags? Yeah, things like that. It doesn't need to be 2 strong tags. Yeah, we had lots of ones like this where it would be lots of spans everywhere. I'm not quite sure who I'm not naming names, but it would be like paragraph and span and paragraph and legend then something else. So just making sure your HTML is okay. And 404 potential problems. So again, lots of images. Some of these ones you can ignore. If the image is just there to look pretty, you don't need to put an alt tag, because there's no point. You might want to put an alt tag with just an empty alt tag just to, pass this. But if it is an image, like for example, this image looks like it has some writing on it, you might just want to put an alt tag, use the alt one, which, oh yeah, it's there, it's empty, and just have it maybe writing what's there. Yeah, so, yeah. lots and lots of images about things. What else? Yeah. Text may refer to items by shape, size, or relative position alone. Yeah, it's a more sort of complicated one. Yeah. Input, I think some of these might be due to the angular ones that it's looking a bit like. But yeah, this is a really good resource to kind of go through and pick which ones you can fix and fix those. It does do a lot of overkill though. So as you can see, it does repeat itself a lot. And it'll tell you things are likely problems, but that's just because it doesn't know if it's a problem. So I'd always get one saying, this JavaScript file, maybe there's some problems there, but it didn't actually look at it. It's just letting you know. Cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We actually had a requirement where we had to make the career sites accessible to those AA standards for our government clients.
Great.
Basically, we expose a default set of styles and clients add their own styles on top of styles, making sure an unstyled site met all of the WCAG standards. What clients actually do is another matter. They've got control of that.
Oh, okay. Yep.
In theory, if they know what they're doing, we're not going to be preventing them. Standards.
Yeah, well, as long as the base one is kind of okay, and yeah, it is really important for those sort of ones as well, because if you've got like an internal one and people can't use it, so if you have a government one and you've got an application that everyone uses and one person is blind and can't access it, then that's employee discrimination in the workforce. You're saying that we haven't made this accessible, so you can't use it, so you can't do your job. So that's part of the reason why this stuff is, it's really important.
I think we've actually got one user as well. I'm not sure which client they're employed by, but they use a screen reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that they've given us various feedback around places where it's horrible.
Yeah, I really recommend if you are doing it to get a screen reader and just test it out, just to kind of hear what they do. I usually cheat and have my eyes open a bit so I can kind of see where it is. But I think ideally you want to have the monitor off while you do it. NVDA is a really good one because that's completely free. Chrome actually have one as well. It's called Chromebox, completely free. I wouldn't just test on Chromebox though, because nobody uses it, unfortunately, because the accessibility features in Chrome are always turned off by default. It's really, really frustrating. So most of the time I would use NVDA and Firefox for testing. It's a nice free one, and you can actually hear it and you can try and navigate it around and just see if there's anywhere where it just doesn't make sense. Or I was looking at our site, and the way it was marked up, it kind of marked up the top and then it did the complementary and then it did the footer and then it kind of did the content under it. So you kind of had to read through everything with a screen reader until you got to the middle part, and it was really frustrating. So yeah, it's really good to just have a listen to that. Yeah.
What are the guidelines for non-web-based applications? For native apps and clients and things like that. Are there any? I mean,
these ones are just for web ones. I'm not sure if there are ones specifically for apps and things. But if you are using something, if you got something with a video, for example, just keep in mind making sure you have the transcript closed caption, but also making sure that you can get to all the controls with the keyboard, and then it says controls like pause, play, all those sorts of things, making sure they can actually get to the transcript or turn on closed captions, just stuff like that. I don't know if there are specific guidelines. These ones are just for web.
But are there government regulations on making these kind of apps also accessible?
I don't think there are yet. I think the government's a little bit behind. They were making really good strides with this stuff, but then they were going to start policing it, which was going to be really good, but then that kind of fell through, so now it's kind of an honor system sort of thing. So I don't think they've thought too much about apps yet. I think maybe, websites first. Yeah. Yep.
You mentioned earlier about officers really having tags that facilitate screen readers, and then there's some examples of that.
Yep.
You had role main, role navigation.
Yep.
Role navigation is actually inside and out tag.
Yep.
How much do do the screen readers rely on like HTML5 elements, like you use the section articles accessibility rollout?
Yep.
Would the screen readers kind of work with the new HTML5 elements a little bit at least, or?
I'll see if my link works. I tested it before and I don't think it does. There is actually a table in the guidelines and it has all the HTML5 elements.
Yep.
If you need a role element and what that role has to be. So nav, even though it has a nav element, that's a new one, you still had to have the role navigation. That was still one of the ones. All the ones I put there were ones that you had to have. There are ones that you don't need it anymore, like forms, which is really good. It just figures it out. But yeah, there are quite a lot that you still need the roles for. Article. I'm not sure about article off the top of my head. It's quite a long table, so I'll see if I can find that in a second. Because yeah, that one's really good, and they are getting a lot better at that sort of stuff, which is great. So you don't have to do it. It's mainly the stuff that's ambiguous, like main content, like how would it know? Yeah.
I'm guessing in the case of HTML5, if you've got a screen reader version which is old and wouldn't know about HTML5, so you'd still need to have the. And like, how many people use like a 10-year-old version of a screen reader versus like an up-to-date one would know about?
Yeah, the up-to-date ones know about it, which is really
the older
good.
version wouldn't know what HTML5 is, and it just.
That's true. I haven't had to deal with that specifically. I think there are like some polyfills and things so that you can to deal with sort of older versions and older browsers and things like that. But all the newer ones kind of deal with it. Fortunately, I haven't had to test on older versions of JAWS, but the newer ones are really good with HTML5. They navigate around really well.
Old versions of IE where a lot of stuff on the top.
Yeah. It is, yeah. It's also the same with banks. Banks are also stuck on the really, really old versions of Internet Explorer. And yeah, if you've had to deal with a bank.
We'll get the screen reader apps themselves.
Screen reader apps.
The same like issue as IE.
I'm not sure as much. I'd have to look into JAWS and see if they let people kind of update and upgrade for free sort of thing.
$900 to upgrade.
Yeah. People aren't going to be paying $900 to upgrade every year to a new version. So I'd have to look into JAWS policies on that. All the other free ones should be fine though. They'd be up to date, I'd imagine. But yeah, that could be a problem because the older versions of JAWS, for example, just can't handle JavaScript at all. They just, Thankfully the newer ones do, so you can put a little bit of JavaScript in there. But yeah, we always make sure that our pages work without it anyway, just to be a bit more robust. Cool. I'll see if that link does work. It worked kind of 2 presentations ago, but I think they might have moved it. But there was one that had had all the HTML5 elements, and if you had to put the roles and things in there. But I think that one doesn't work. I'll see if I can find it and I can send it through. But it was a really, really fantastic table because all this documentation is so hard to read. Yeah, so I'll see if I can find that and I'll send it through. Okay. I think that's all we have time for. I can stick around for a bit, so if anyone's got any more specific questions, feel free to come grab me. Cool, thanks for that.
We should actually get a look at the